Thank you for joining me today for our daily reading of the Spirit of Prophecy, the great controversy between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angels, Volume 3, 1878, by Ellen G. White. We're now in Chapter 30, Imprisonment of Paul and Silas, page 378 to 387. And before I do read to you this chapter, I would like to invite you for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, O Lord Most High God, the only true God, I thank you and I praise you that I'm alive. Be with us through your Spirit as I read this chapter in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. After a time, Paul again visited Lystra, where he had been greeted as a god by the heathen, where the opposing Jews had followed on his track, and by falsehood and misrepresentation had turned the reverence of the people into insult, abuse, and a determination to kill him. Yet we find him again on the scene of his former danger, looking after the fruit of his labors there. He found that the converts of Christ had not been intimidated by the violent persecution of the apostles, but on the contrary were confirmed in the faith, believing that through trial and suffering the kingdom of Christ would be reached. Paul found that Timothy was closely bound to him by the ties of Christian union. This man had been instructed in the Holy Scriptures from his childhood and educated for a strictly religious life. He had witnessed the sufferings of Paul upon his former visit to Lystra, and the bonds of Christian sympathy had knit his heart firmly to that of the apostle. Paul accordingly thought best to take Timothy with him to assist in his labors. The extreme caution of Paul is manifested in this act. He had refused the companionship of Mark because he dared not trust him in an emergency. But in Timothy, he saw one who fully appreciated the ministerial work, who respected his position and was not appalled at the prospect of suffering and persecution. Yet he did not venture to accept Timothy, an untried youth, without diligent inquiry with regard to his life and character. After fully satisfying himself on those points, Paul received Timothy as his fellow laborer and son in the gospel. Paul, with his usual good judgment, caused Timothy to be circumcised. Not that God required it, but in order to remove from the minds of the Jews an obstacle to Timothy's ministration. Paul was to labor from place to place in the synagogues and there to preach Christ. If his companion should be known as an uncircumcised heathen, the work of both would be greatly hindered by the prejudice and bigotry of the people. The apostle everywhere met a storm of persecution. He desired to bring the Jews to Christianity and sought, as far as was consistent with the faith, to remove every pretext for opposition. Yet while he conceded this much to Jewish prejudice, his faith and teachings declared that circumcision or uncircumcision was nothing but the gospel of Christ was everything. At Philippi, Lydia of the city of Thyatira heard the apostles, and her heart was open to receive the truth. She and her household were converted and baptized, and she entreated the apostles to make her house their home. Day after day, as they went to their devotions, a woman with the spirit of divination followed them, crying, "These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show us into the way of salvation." This woman was a special agent of Satan, and as the devils were troubled by the permanent presence of Christ, so the evil spirit which possessed her was ill at ease in the presence of the apostles. Satan knew that his kingdom was invaded and took this way of opposing the work of the ministers of God. The words of recommendation uttered by this woman were an injury to the cause, distracting the minds of the people from the truths presented to them, and throwing disrepute upon the work of causing people to believe that the man who spoke with the spirit and power of God were actuated by the same spirit as the emissary of Satan. The apostles endured this opposition for several days. Then Paul, under inspiration of the Spirit of God, commanded the evil spirit to leave the woman. Satan was thus met and rebuked. The immediate and continued silence of the woman testified that the apostles were the servants of God, and that the demon had acknowledged them to be such and have obeyed their command. When the woman was dispossessed of the spirit of the devil and restored to herself, her masters were alarmed for their craft. They saw that all hope of receiving money from her divinations and soothsayings was at an end, and perceived that if the apostles were allowed to continue their work, their own source of income would soon be entirely cut off. A mighty cry was therefore raised against the servants of God, for many were interested in gaining money by satanic delusions. They brought the apostles before the magistrates with the charge that these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, being Romans. So Satan stirred up a frenzy among the people. Mob spirit prevailed and was sanctioned by the authorities, who, with their official hands, tore the clothes from the apostles and commanded them to be scourged. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. The apostles were left in a very painful condition. Their lacerated and bleeding backs were in contact with the rough stone floor, while their feet were elevated and bound fast in the stocks. In this unnatural position, they suffered extreme torture, yet they did not groan nor complain, but conversed with and encouraged each other, and praised God with grateful hearts that they were found worthy to suffer shame for his dear name. Paul was reminded of the persecution he had been instrumental in heaping upon the disciples of Christ, and he was devoutly thankful that his eyes had been opened to see and his heart to feel the glorious truths of the gospel of the Son of God, and that he had been privileged to preach the doctrine which he had once despised. There in the pitchy darkness and desolation of the dungeon, Paul and Silas prayed and sang songs of praise to God. The other prisoners heard with astonishment the voice of prayer and praise issuing from the inner prison. They had been accustomed to hear shrieks and moans, cursing and swearing, breaking at night upon the silence of the prison, but they had never before heard the words of prayer and praise ascending from the gloomy cell. The guards and prisoners marveled who were these men who, cold, hungry, and tortured, could still rejoice and converse cheerfully with each other. Meanwhile, the magistrates had returned to their homes, congratulating themselves upon having quelled a tumult by their prompt and decisive measures. But upon their way home, they heard more fully concerning the character and work of the man whom they had sentenced to scourging and imprisonment. They also saw the woman who had been freed from satanic influence, who had been a very troublesome subject to them. They were sensibly struck by the change in her countenance and demeanor. She had become quiet, peaceful, and possessed of her right mind. They were indignant with themselves when they discovered that in all probability they had visited upon two innocent men the rigorous penalty of the Roman law against the worst criminals. They decided that in the morning they would command them to be privately released and escorted in safety from the city beyond the danger of violence from the mob. But while men were cruel and vindictive or criminally negligent of the solemn responsibilities devolving upon them, God had not forgotten to be gracious to his suffering servants. An angel was sent from heaven to release the apostles. As he neared the Roman prison, the earth trembled beneath his feet. The whole city was shaken by the earthquake, and the prison walls reeled like a reed in the wind. The heavenly vaulted doors flew open. The chains and fetters fell from the hands and feet of every prisoner. The keeper of the jail had heard with amazement the prayers and singing of the imprisoned apostles. When they were led in, he had seen their swollen and bleeding wounds, and he had himself caused their feet to be fastened in the instruments of torture. He had expected to hear bitter wailing groans and imprecations, but lo, his ears were greeted with joyful praise. He fell asleep with these sounds in his ear, but was awakened by the earthquake and the shaking of the prison walls. Upon awakening, he saw all the prison doors open, and his first thought was that all the prisoners had escaped. He remembered that he remembered with what an explicit charge the prisoners of the night before had been entrusted to his care, and he felt sure that death would be the penalty of his apparent unfaithfulness. He cried out in the bitterness of his spirit that it was better for him to die by his own hand than to submit to a disgraceful execution. He was about to kill himself when Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here. For we are all here." The severity with which the jailer had treated the apostles had not roused their sentiment, or they would allow him to commit suicide. But their hearts were filled with the love of Christ, and they held no malice against their persecutors. The jailer dropped his sword and called for a light. He fastened into the inner dungeon and fell down before Paul and Silas, begging their forgiveness. He then brought them up into the open court and inquired of them, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" He had trembled because of the wrath of God expressed in the earthquake. He had been ready to die by his own hand for fear of the penalty of the Roman law. When he thought the prisoners had escaped, but now all these things were of little consequence to him compared with the new and strange dread that agitated his mind and his desire to possess that tranquility and cheerfulness manifested by the apostles under their extreme suffering and abuse. He saw the light of heaven mirrored in their countenances. He knew that God had interposed in a miraculous manner to save their lives. And the words of the woman possessed by the power of divination came to his mind with peculiar force. "These men are the servants of the Most High God, which showed unto us the way of salvation." He saw his own deplorable condition in contrast with that of the disciples, and with deep humility and reverence asked them to show him the way of life. And they said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house." And they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and to all that were in his house. The jailer then washed the wounds of the apostles and ministered to them, and was baptized by them. A sanctifying influence spread among the inmates of the prison, and the hearts of all were open to receive the truths uttered by the apostles. They were convinced also that the living God whom these men served had miraculously released them from bondage. The citizens had been greatly terrified by the earthquake. When the officers informed the magistrates in the morning of what had occurred at the prison, they were alarmed and sent the surgeons to liberate the apostles from prison. But Paul said unto them, "They have beaten us openly and uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison, and now do they thrust us out privily. Nay, verily, but let them come themselves and fetch us up." Paul and Silas felt that to maintain the dignity of Christ's church, they must not submit to the illegal course proposed by the Roman magistrators. The apostles were Roman citizens, and it was unlawful to scourge a Roman, save for the most flagrant crime, or to deprive him of his liberty without a fair trial and condemnation. They had been publicly thrust into prison and now refused to be privately released without proper acknowledgments on the part of the magistrates. When this word was brought to the authorities, they were alarmed for fear the apostles would make complaint of their unlawful treatment to the emperor and cause the magistrates to lose their positions. They accordingly visited the prison, apologized to the apostles for their injustice and cruelty, and themselves conducted them out of the prison and entreated them to depart out of the city. Thus the Lord wrought for his servants in their extremity. The magistrates entreated them to depart because they feared their influence over the people. And the power of heaven that had interposed in behalf of those innocent men who had been unlawfully scourged and imprisoned, acting upon the principles given them by Christ. The apostles would not urge their presence where it was not desired. They complied with the request of the magistrates, but did not hasten their departure. Precipitously, they went rejoicing from the prison to the house of Lydia, where they met the new converts to the faith of Christ and related all the wonderful dealings of God with them. They related their night's experience in the conversion of the keeper of the prison and of the prisoners. The apostles viewed their labors in Philippi as not in vain. They there met much opposition and persecution, but the intervention of providence in their behalf and the conversion of the jailer and all his house more than atoned for the disgrace and suffering they had endured. The Philippians saw represented in the deportment and presence of mind of the apostles, the spirit of the religion of Jesus Christ. The apostles might have fled with the earthquake, opened their prison doors, and loosened their fetters, but that would have been an acknowledgement that they were criminals, which would have been a disgrace to the gospel of Christ. The jailer would have been exposed to the penalty of death, and the general influence would have been bad, as it was. Paul controlled the liberated prisoners so perfectly that not one attempted to escape. The Philippians could not acknowledge the nobility and generosity of the apostles in their course of action, especially in forbearing the appeal to a higher power against the magistrates who had persecuted them. The news of their unjust imprisonment and miraculous deliverance was noised about through all that region and brought the apostles and their ministry before the notice of a large number who would not otherwise have been reached. Christianity was placed upon a high plane, and the converts to the faith were greatly strengthened. Thus, we have the establishment of the church at Philippi under peculiar circumstances, and its numbers steadily increased. Among them were many men of wealth and influence, whose noble generosity and ready sympathy were over on the side of the right. They often came to the aid of the apostles in their affliction and pecuniary necessity. Paul said of these brethren, "Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica he sent once and again unto my necessity." He sends also salutations from the brethren to Caesar's household, for officers in the employment of the emperor had been converted under the labors of the apostles and through the wonderful manifestations of God in their deliverance from prison. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 31, Opposition at Thessalonica. May the only true God and his Son, Jesus Christ, continue to bless you and keep you. This is my prayer.